we are so lucky to have two stellar faculty members who have dedicated themselves to preparing trainees. The first is Rachel Adams. She's a PhD, professor of English and Comparative Literature in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and she was a recipient of the 2021 Faculty Mentoring Award. And we also have with us Jaime Rubin, PhD, who is Vice Chair for Investigator Development at the Department of Medicine at the Columbia University Irving Medical Center. I'm also delighted to introduce our moderator, my boss, Dr. Dennis Mitchell, who is the Senior Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement and the EVP for University Life. And with that, I turn it over to you, Dennis.
Thank you, Adina, and thank you, Jaime and Rachel, for joining us here today. We're excited to have this conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. I have a few questions that I've put aside here to start with, but later we'll open up audience questions. So please leave any questions that you have on the chat, and the team will make sure to get them to me. We're going to start by asking each of the panelists to introduce yourself and speak broadly about your work and the types of trainees that you support to provide some context for today's conversation. We'll have Rachel go first and then followed by Jaime. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dennis, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I have to say that receiving a Faculty Mentoring Award was one of the biggest honors of my career at Columbia. I consider that not only really important work, but work that often is invisible. And so it was just such a delight to be recognized in that way. So I am a professor in the English department, and I don't really have trainees in the way that Adina described. I'll talk about the people that I mentor. I like to think of these relationships more in terms of mentoring, but perhaps as the conversation goes on, we'll also nuance those terms, and maybe I'll come to see them more as trainees. But in my capacity in the English department, I do two things. One is I do work with graduate students, and I guess they would be the closest to trainees, although I don't know that they imagine themselves in that way. But our relationship starts with coursework where I'm doing more to, impart what I know to them, but also supporting their development as writers and researchers. And then the process, in humanities, it is a looser process, but I guess to describe it in the most general terms, it's about, supporting them as they develop an independent voice and, research expertise as scholars. And one of the most challenging things about working with graduate students in the humanities, or at least in my humanistic discipline, is that everybody has to work out the methods for themselves. So there is no teaching them how to use the pipette. Like you basically send them off and you're like, go to the library and find your own pipette and figure out how to work it best for yourself. But the other thing I do is I do mentor faculty who are, less senior than I am. So I recently had a big success. Our department started a more formal mentoring program maybe 8 years ago. And so I was given my first, I'd always advised my more junior colleagues, but given my first official mentee, and I worked with him from the moment he arrived through, writing his first book to going up for tenure. And he faced a lot of obstacles, and he got tenure last year. And so in that way, I feel like that was another huge success of last year, getting the award and actually seeing my my junior colleague get tenure. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk more about any of this as we get into the discussion.
I guess I'll go next. Thank you, Rachel, for leading off, and thank you for the for all of the organizers for today's session. I'm looking forward to a very interesting and diverse discussion. So as Dennis mentioned, I'm the Vice Chair for Investigative Development in the Department of Medicine. I would say I've had a number of different positions at the medical center over the years, and they've all involved, I would say, junior investigators. Was involved in starting the Office of Graduate Affairs. I'm involved with graduate students, doctoral students, postdocs, clinical faculty, clinical fellows, junior faculty in other departments, residents, and even undergraduates and high school students to some degree. And I would sort of divide my responsibilities maybe in two different buckets. One is direct interaction in terms of career development at their current stage, and then helping them successfully transition to the next career stage at each of these levels. And the other is all the folks that I interact with as a result of my two career development courses, one on funding and grantsmanship and the other one on responsible conduct of research. And in fact, in the RCR course, we have two sessions on mentorship. The first one is on the first session of the semester, and we just had one last week on mentoring of a diverse group of trainees, the emphasis that we put on mentorship. One highlight I would say is the formal young faculty mentoring program that we have in the Department of Medicine. We've had it for nearly 20 years, and it's a very formalized program, in addition to all of the, I would say, less formal career development interactions. And if I would end on a highlight like Rachel did, I would say it's those emails that I receive that have exclamation marks in the subject line. I look forward to opening those emails.
And we all know those, so that's why I'm smiling. That's great. So let's get to some questions. So the first one I have up is a starter, really. In your own personal experiences, what has been the most important in terms of establishing a mentoring relationship with your mentees, trainees, however you want to refer to them? What do you think has been the most important thing you have done or have learned to do to establish that relationship?
Well, I'll just start. I'll just jump in and say I think making time and listening to them. I think everybody is very busy. I think it's making time and listening to them and having a discussion on their terms. And I think also realizing that not one mentor can serve all of their needs. They probably should have different mentors for different areas of responsibility, for research, for teaching, obviously, for clinical, whatever their other responsibilities are. And also folks at different career levels. I like the concept of peer mentoring and near peer mentoring. I especially like the concept of near peers, folks that have successfully finished whatever career stage the mentee is currently at and successfully transition to the next stage. I think those folks can really be helpful.
I think everything Jaime said was very wise. So all of that. And then I would add a couple of things. So for me, I could not agree more about making time. I think the face time that you can spend, especially at Colombia, where everybody's rushing and people are traveling all the time, to make time to spend with people who need your advice and also your collegiality. But then in what I do, you also have to make time to read people's work. And I think the longer I do this, the more I realize how important that is. And I used to feel like you know, going through the motions was better than nothing. And I have increasingly come to take seriously the importance, because that's in my field, that's what people are judged on. And so that's where I can make the biggest intervention. I guess two other things I would say that I always start from a position of deep respect for my colleagues, whatever level they're at, and my graduate students, but more so this is when I'm mentoring junior colleagues, is that I really am aware of how much I have to learn from people who are at a different place in the profession, and they're like reading all the latest theories and they know what's going on. And so I really try to treat it as a dialogue and to learn from them as much as trying to, you know, teach them something that I have to offer. That said, you know, this is funny. I was on a panel that Dennis chaired like maybe 5 years ago. I don't know if you remember that, but I made a friend there. She was in the audience, and she's a more junior colleague, and she's actually taught me something else that I think is really important, is that at the same time that I break down these barriers and I try to learn from my more junior colleagues, that there also have to be boundaries. And the way I learned from her, she told me about some cases where she felt like people really disregarded those and were, you know, like oversharing or asking things of her that were not, she didn't feel was appropriate to someone at her level. And so, so I like to think of it as a friendship and a partnership, at the same time that I try to be mindful of the position that person is, how they're vulnerable, what their concerns are, and how those are different from mine.
Wonderful. Such important points from you both. This idea of near peer and peer mentoring, I can't agree more. I don't know, the more people think that I'm mentoring them, the more I actually learn from them. So I feel like every encounter is a peer or near peer mentoring experience for me now at this stage. And Rachel, I must say, I am just thrilled to hear that where people are meeting people at our events. I can't wait to get back to the in-person meetings because the Zoom has been a wonderful opportunity to take advantage of the pandemic and not stop, but we lost that, you know, it's the after the meeting or before the meeting, we lost that so much, and I can't wait for us to begin to get that back. So it's great. So can you both speak to your approach to giving feedback? What has worked well for you, and sometimes more importantly, what hasn't worked? You know, what are the what has failed? Sometimes sharing that really helps people a great deal.
Well, one thing I wanted to say, I think folks appreciate when you say, I don't know, because sometimes they ask me questions that are outside my area of experience or expertise, like the Colombia tenure process. So there are other folks on campus in the Department of Medicine, Jen was one of them, that really understand that process a lot better than I do. So I think folks appreciate, instead of getting half answers or non-answers, to give them a better person to speak to. I think they appreciate that. I think, of course, time and also honesty. And I think also what Rachel said about sort of honoring their work. So I read lots of pieces of people's grant applications and comment on it. And I mean, I used to, when we were in person, I would handwrite comments and then send them the documents. And now we go through thing in detail. I think they really appreciate that. That demonstrates that your comments are not template comments and you really read their work. So I think they're very appreciative of that because they realize how busy everybody is.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add to that. Making time to meet in person. And then also I give a lot of written feedback. And in fact, in what I do, there's a self-interest to it. So people that I mentor nearly always need letters of support and also reports written on them. So it's a very significant part of the promotion process at Columbia that at each stage of review, you're writing reports on people. And so one thing that I've learned is that if I give people written comments, and especially if I not only write out my list of, here's 3 things for you to work on, but I actually try to summarize the argument that the person is making. So first of all, it solidifies my understanding, but then I also have a record of that. So when I then have to describe that to others, I have it there. So I do think the written is extremely important, both for me and for that person, just because the letters are so important. But then I think the FaceTime also, and I guess, learning the hard way. I mean, we all know this, but I'm sure everybody has had the experience of you give someone a written comment, especially in an email, and the tone is completely misunderstood. And then you have to meet them in person and try to make everything better. And, in fact, if you just could have a dialogue as well as the written thing, then that could have been avoided in the first place. So I think the combination of the 2 methods is extremely valuable. The other thing I will say in what I do is that we have increasingly built group meetings into our mentoring. So our graduate students now, when they write a chapter, not all of my colleagues are cooperative, but you're supposed to meet as a committee with them. And then also we do this with our untenured colleagues. When they get reviewed, you sit down with the chair and with usually 1 representative. And I think there's something really important about having multiple voices and sort of not. So I totally agree with Jaime that it's important to send people, like if they're asking you something that's not your area of expertise, to send them to the right person. But there also are a lot of circumstances where having advice from 2 or 3 different mouths can be extremely valuable, and having the reality check of other people in the room to kind of, bounce their ideas off each other. At the same time, there are ways that can go very wrong. So that also has to be balanced against having the person feel like they're on a firing squad or something. So, in the right context, the group meeting to support someone can be extremely effective, I think.
Such great nuggets. In particular, that nugget you left us, Rachel, about the letters and keeping track of that. I think we can all tell why you were nominated for and won that mentoring award, because that's brilliant. I'm going to start doing that. I like that. It's quite a bit. Wonderful. So let's talk about the time-consuming challenge of mentoring, right? What are some of the strategies that you have found that help in any way to make it a bit less time-consuming, or anything that you could drop that would be helpful around that?
I think one key is that they shouldn't know how time pressed we are, and that, to believe it or not, that the hour that they're with us or whenever we've dedicated that hour, not checking the phone or watch or something like that. And one other thing I would say is that from my time in the graduate school, I remember thinking, I just love their stories. They're all interesting people. To have gotten here, they're all smart. They're all interesting. They've all done incredible things. I just loved hearing their stories and what they've done. And I always start every meeting with, tell me something about yourself. And I want to hear it. And I ask them questions and so forth. And I remember one day recently, pre-pandemic, but meeting with 3 people. And the end of the day, I remember thinking, I just met such 3 smart, incredible people. How lucky am I to have met individuals like that? I also write letters, but I think I write different types of letters than Rachel. I don't write letters of reference. My letters are more letters of support that go into their grant applications about what I'm going to do for them if and when they get the grant. So unfortunately, it's a little bit more about me and my background and what service I'm going to provide during the course of the grant. But before I do that, I always ask them to send me their bio sketch, which is sort of NIH speak for a resume or CV. And I pick out successes, gems, honors, publications, whatever. And I weave it into my letter just to make sure the reviewers made sure that they saw those things. And they're always get one of those emails back with exclamation marks. I think they're all surprised that I've actually listened to when they talked about themselves or was interested in their successes and those kinds of things. And it wasn't all sort of template. So I think those kinds of things also.
I love that advice. I always am surprised when, because I don't know what else to say when someone comes in my office except how are you? But a lot of them seem surprised to be asked like that. Maybe they're talking to other colleagues who don't ask, especially the graduate students seem very grateful to be asked how they are and about their stories. So I agree with that. And I think it does allow you to be a better mentor when you know someone's story. And I totally agree about making time. Although here's the other thing I'm going to say is that so I try to make that a priority, that I have time for the people I've agreed to support. At the same time, I think it is an obligation to make clear to them how little time I have. And, you know, as a woman and having been an untenured woman at Columbia, I am very aware that there are certain kinds of people that get way more than their share of supporting those beneath them. And it's not just the writing letters or being on the committee, it's the invisible labor. It's supporting someone when they have a personal crisis or when they have a writer's block, whatever. So I need those people to understand my humanity and the way my time is constrained. And I, you know, that's part of my training of them too, because I do not want them to grow up into people who don't regard others as, you know, fully rounded people with lives outside. And so I try to, you know, when they ask me how I am, I tell them. And when I don't have time for them, I explain that. So I think there's some give and take even as you, but I also, I couldn't agree more that when you make the hour for them, you make it feel like that's about them and not that you're constantly texting with someone else or what have you.
Important points. So let's move over to teaching, right? How do you support your mentees in their teaching? What do you have any common concerns that you've seen or experienced with them, and how have you been able to help address those issues?
I'm going to defer to Rachel on that one because we don't have too much teaching responsibilities at the medical campus.
Sorry, can you rephrase? I'm trying to understand. I think I'm.
So when how do you support your mentees in their teaching, right? As they're trying to, figure it out and get to their sweet spot.
Sorry, I thought you were asking about teaching them. Okay, so as teachers.
Yes.
Oh, that's a great question, because but it's kind of the same answer that I've given already, is that on the one hand, I often feel like I do have something to offer them. And so I try to be really available when people want to be observed, and like go and sit fly on the wall in their class and take a lot of notes and give them feedback. That is something that is relatively new in my division, that it hasn't, like, for many of my years at Columbia, I never observed anyone. And so with graduate students, and not so much with colleagues, I actually have heard of colleagues who were required to be observed for their various reviews, and we don't really have that in English. However, the other side of me that thinks I always have something to learn, I try to go into those classrooms aware that I'm also benefiting. So I love any opportunity to see my colleagues teaching, where I can learn from their tricks as well as giving them feedback. So, and I think that also is the best way to provide the feedback, is to kind of make it a mutual conversation. And I think that maybe I'm going to take this back if anyone thinks this is a bad idea, but I guess I think that if I'm going to observe anyone else's teaching, that I would also welcome them to see me teaching, because you not only want to be in the position of giving feedback, but also modeling and perhaps taking feedback from others. So, so often a part of the training of our graduate students is that they are TAs for class. I don't usually teach classes that are big enough to have TAs, but that's a great opportunity for them to see their professors in action, also to see a syllabus being built. And then what a lot of us do is to give them opportunities to teach a class or a part of a class, because that having a chance to lecture is not something that is often so common to the graduate student experience. So you give them that like in a microcosm, and I think they not only get to practice, but they also see how hard it is, and it gives them a sense of what that work is going to be like in their future.
So important. I like that a lot, Rachel. I think that we should all try to model whenever we're able to. It's really smart move. So let's shift to networking, right? How do you provide guidance to mentees on how best to network? And obviously things have been just crazy these last couple of years to network, but let's go back to the good old days when we could actually do that in person in a much better way. What advice do you give to mentees for networking?
Well, I advise that they network as much as possible, that they go to national conferences. Of course, there's been this gap in 2 years, which is very unfortunate for folks at this particular career stage. It's sort of been a void. And even though some conferences have tried to be held virtually, it's not, why prepare an elevator speech if you're never in an elevator, right? But to use as many opportunities as possible to network at Columbia, go to your professional societies, get your name out there, go to New York City events and so forth. I mean, I always say, you never know who you're going to meet. You never know what's going to happen. The worst is maybe you gave up a little time, and people need to be pushed, especially the first one, right? There's that sort of coefficient of friction of just sort of getting going the first time. And it is intimidating. a few years ago, we had a research fellowship, and the first conference we sent everybody to was a student research conference. So the first time they're among their peers, they're presenting to their peers, they're all in their poster presentations. And then the next conference, which will be their national conference, let's say, for the next 40 years of their life, they've already presented, they've already given oral poster presentations. So just to break that ice, they know it's important to network, but it's just very hard to put yourself out there. And of course, some folks, by personality or cultural background, whatever, it's even harder for some than others.
I actually think the pandemic has not been that bad for networking, in that just compared to like when I was at graduate school, like what you can do with email now is, and you know, not everyone reads their email, but I think I'm a big fan of, like, if you read someone's work and you like it, then you write to that person and tell them. And so there are a lot of opportunities to do that. And then I also like to think about, as I'm speaking to my graduate students and junior colleagues, to think about others I know in the profession. And again, email is a great way to, that's often the best way to do it, is not to tell the person, oh, you should send an email to that author, but let me connect you so that it comes through a known person, and then you let the conversation go from there. And I actually think for people who are newer to this and might be more intimidated, like the written word is a great way. And if you already have a conversation with someone, then when you meet them at a conference or a dinner or whatever, then you're going to have a foundation for that. And that's also always what I tell my students and colleagues who are seeking to publish, is that I have seen with horror, like I go to these conferences and there's like the book room, and I see people like walk up to an editor at their, stall and start pitching their book on the spot. And I'm like, that is the worst idea. I like write to the person first with a well thought out proposal for your book and ask them to make time to meet with you. If they're not interested, fine, you know that in advance, but don't go up and just start impromptu. I think that very rarely works. So I'm a big fan of the written word. The other thing I encourage with both junior faculty and grad students, Columbia really has a lot of like small pots of money for bringing people to campus. And now, that's just starting to happen again, but it's also possible with Zoom. And when you invite someone and they are kind of on your turf, it gives you a foundation to build that relationship. So I think it's great when a grad student gets to be the one who invites a speaker to campus, or like I'll try to always organize a social gather, like a dinner with the speaker, and really put the graduate students at the center of that, because it puts them on a more, equitable grounding than if they were to approach that person cold. So I think part of, being a good mentor is making those opportunities. And just like the more I know these people, I don't feel like I need to be in the center, just to make it an opportunity for them to mingle with others who can really benefit from it.
Such great ideas. I particularly love the idea of writing to people whose writing you appreciate. We don't get enough of that, and that's a great mentoring nugget. Outstanding. So let's talk about Columbia in particular, because we are arguably the most, or one of the most difficult institutions to navigate, right? We've got more silos than almost anyone, right? We're proud of our decentralized sort of self. How do you help mentees deal with the feelings of being overwhelmed and frustration that can be experienced in a place like Colombia? And how do you help them be more resilient?
I mean, that's very good. That's a good question, because a lot of folks don't come from institutions as large as Columbia, right? And they were undergraduates or whatever at much smaller institutions, not in a big city. It is overwhelming. We're overwhelmed. And I think it's to try, first of all, don't take anything personally if somebody doesn't respond. And to reach out, or to try the approach that Rachel mentioned, is to have somebody send an electronic introduction, if you will, and then you'll probably get a response. I tell folks, let's say when they're looking for, let's say, a mentor, they might say something like, Columbia student looking for a research mentor, in the subject line, because then the faculty member is much more apt to open up that email than so many emails they get every day from around the world looking for a research mentor. But if you say Columbia student, Columbia postdoc, whatever, in the subject line, I think you're going to get a much higher percentage of hits, if you will. And to keep trying. I think now, show up in people's offices now. I think that says something. When you've bothered to cross the street or change campuses, I think that I like walking around now and saying hi to everybody in person. So I think that sends a message also.
That's all excellent advice. I think this is a very good question, because it's important to start off with the acknowledgement that Columbia is not for everyone. And I try to be really clear. I mean, this is not really something you can do when you're recruiting a colleague. I think it's, it's such a good job. Most colleagues are going to come whether or not this is going to end up being the best. And I have genuinely seen colleagues who leave either on their own steam or because they had to, and flourish somewhere else. So it's definitely not for everyone. With grad students, I try to say exactly what Dennis said about the nature of Columbia, and talk about the kind, because I do think there are people who thrive here, and also some people who might not seem like they would thrive and then find that. I actually think of myself as that, like, I'm a very quiet, introverted person who came here and was forced to do a lot of things that were really scary for me. And I think I grew as a result. And I think that gives me compassion for, like, I'll tell you one thing that I remember very vividly, going to a reception, and I finally found someone to talk to. I didn't know anyone there. It was like my first or second year at Columbia. And like, I was so grateful. I finally got in a conversation with someone, and then she started looking around the room. Like, clearly she felt that she should be circulating. And she finally said, well, I should probably, move on to talk to someone else. And I was really, devastated to then be left to my, so I try to look out for that person and like talk to them, because I do think that's one of the challenges of a big place that can often be impersonal. But then also, as Jaime was saying, just making time for people, making time to have visits. So at the same time that you explain how busy you are, also to make students and those who are more junior feel like they are a priority in terms of your time. It's so much more important at a place that's big and impersonal, and where everyone is constantly talking about where they're traveling and how busy they are, to kind of work against that. Because I don't think that is always conducive to the thriving of people whose success relies on having, connections with others.
One thing I wanted to mention in terms of thriving and so they know we hear them, and we didn't mention this type of mentoring is sort of self-mentoring, and I'll give it, or mentoring as a group or something like that. And I'll give it an example, and perhaps that can be, there are similar examples in other fields where our junior investigators in clinical and epidemiology were sort of all over the place. And because they're sort of clinical, they don't interact with that many people, and they're very much sort of on their own. And they asked that there would be monthly meetings where they could come together and talk about their work to each other without, at the beginning, outside speakers, just so they could get to know each other and network with each other and so forth. And all it really cost, if you will, on our part was reserving a room and buying pizza. And now, of course, it's part of the fabric, or I hope we go back to it. And they don't really know now that a few years ago it was started by some very junior people who thought there was that need. And this way they know about each other and each other's work and have begun to collaborate, where before there really wasn't a forum for them to hear about each other's work.
Such a great point. So let's explore that. You know, what, and I know, Rachel, you mentioned sort of the outside funding opportunities, but what are some resources that you all have experienced here, again, at Columbia or outside, that we can use for our mentees here at Columbia that have allowed us to connect with mentees, allowed them to connect? Are there any other specific ones that you could point to, both ones that are internal, but even external ones that can help in this area?
Well, I can pick up from what I said. I mean, I do think the little pots of money that I'm like, you don't need very much money. And one thing I'm always telling my students is that most scholars are delighted to come to Columbia. And so you don't need, I mean, not everyone, but many people will come for a very small honorarium, especially if you say that you're a graduate student group. Now with Zoom, you really can just give them a little honorarium. You don't even, and some people will come for free, like if you pay for their trip to New York. So, so you'd be surprised at how little money it actually takes, but that the money is here. And this, more broadly, the GSAS, a while ago now started these graduate colloquia where they give, their students are required to belong to at least one, but ours are like mushrooms. So every year the students come up with a new topic that doesn't have a colloquia, and there are so many of them. And the great thing is that I think as long as you come up with a worthy topic, you can have as many as you want, and each one gets a very, very small pot of money. But what you can do, I mean, like $1,500 for the entire year, but that goes such a long way among grad students. They use it to buy some snacks, and sometimes there's like one bottle of cheap wine. They use it to bring a speaker, and we go out for a very cheap meal. And I'm always encouraging them also to just spend a lot of time ear to the ground, like figure out who is in New York this year. And almost always there's like more than enough speakers that you would want to come or visit. So you don't even have to spend money on travel or accommodation. So I really think that is a wonderful resource. And then the other thing that we now have available for our untenured faculty is there, I wish we had had this when I was a junior faculty, is there's a fund to bring someone to read your book manuscript and kind of do a workshop with them and perhaps entertain them a little bit. And I think that is such a wonderful way both to get the feedback on, I mean, that first book is so important to whether someone will survive at Columbia. So you get the feedback from someone who's, like fully agreed to do that, but then also you start to build a relationship with that person. And so those are just a couple that come to the top of my head that are really inexpensive ways to enhance a lot of people's lives.
And one thing I would say is they don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know what questions to ask right now, right? So they don't know to say, is there this type of program? Is there this type of resource? Will I be, they don't even know, they haven't been to graduate school before or been a postdoc or whatever before. So part of it, our job is to listen to them and figure out what they need and what will help them excel at this career stage, as well as transition to the next, and let them know the resources that are out there.
So important, so important. All right, so let's flip the lens, right? Instead of viewing out to our mentees, let's flip the lens from them viewing into us, right? What's missing from their perspective? What are they missing from that they're not getting in general from their faculty, their PIs? What do they wish that their faculty and PIs knew? Have you come across, a few nuggets that could be helpful there?
I think, it's very different times. I think it's probably field dependent, the pressure to publish in specific journals and so forth, the pressure for money, the competition. I think that's why it's important to have near peers at closer stages that they can really understand their particular situation.
All right, I'm going to add something different. I mean, I think that's completely true. So when I arrived at Columbia and through the entire time that I was untenured, there was not a single woman in my department who was pregnant, nor was there anyone. So anyone who was a parent was completely invisible. There was no child that was ever seen. Nobody ever talked about, you just acted as if it didn't exist. So, so one tremendously positive change. I think that people who are parents, especially people who are untenured or are graduate student parents, feel that those who are not parents, or even those who are parents but are tenured, they just lose the perspective of how incredibly hard it is to juggle those different responsibilities. And I think that the people who were above me, especially the women, were shaped. I mean, I totally understand why they made that invisible, but I think that's one thing that continues to be it really is like there's two classes at Columbia, and the people who are parents understand what it's like to juggle. Or if you're, I was on a panel with Dennis about caregiving. So maybe you're the caregiver for a dependent parent or something. So it's not exclusively about being a parent, but that's like the most common example of having entirely dependent and incredibly expensive beings who rely on you. Meanwhile, all the demands. Now, the other thing that I have more specialized knowledge about, so I work a lot on issues of disability. And so because of that, I've kind of become a magnet for, many, many colleagues across the campus who are ill or disabled, some of them, in ways that are visible and some that are not known and just need someone to talk to, or they have a family member who's going through this. And that is another area where I think people feel incredibly unsupported. And unlike parenting, where I just cannot speak enough, I know it's not perfect, but the progress I have seen at Columbia is astounding, like toward, recognizing those responsibilities and supporting people is huge. But the other part, like supporting people who are dealing with illness or disability at a more vulnerable stage in their careers, whether they're graduate students or faculty, or are caring for a person in such a condition, is really underdeveloped. And sadly, there are lots of cases of people who I have been working with and trying to support who have simply had to leave because they can't survive here. And sadly, a lot of cases where if the person had tenure, they would have been able, they would have been accommodated in a way that it is much harder to do when the whole reason they're here is to produce in a certain way that's in considerable tension with whatever situation they're dealing with in their bodies and their health.
Yeah, so important. And you're right, there's been a change. And you were representing it as one or the other, but we can't forget those that are sandwiched, who are even more challenged with, well, there's no level of challenge, it's all challenging, but the sandwiched generation faculty members are really having a hard time. So important points. So Jaime, you mentioned publishing. So let's talk a little bit about publishing and research. How do you handle co-authorships? And what kind of advice are you giving mentees in this area, or how are you handling it yourself? How do you provide, and I think, Rachel, you shared some of this, how do you provide feedback on drafts? How do you help prepare mentees for research, for ultimate research independence? Right? Talk a little bit about that, because I think that would resonate for our audience.
I give the presentation on publications and authorship in the Responsible Conduct of Research course. And one of the requirements of the course is that they write an essay on some RCR topic. And I would say that a very high percentage of them are the papers, the subject is publications, and also authorship, and who gets to be an author and so forth. So they are very concerned about publications, authorship, being the first author. And as you probably know now, there's more than one first author, and who gets listed as the more than one first author, and so forth. And I think that is a real concern. And when I give the presentation and I say that, there is this organization of medical journal editors, and they've looked into it, and they have actually criteria, bullet points of what, constitutes who should be an author. I think they're a little surprised that there is some sort of structure to the whole thing, as opposed to it's decided de novo with every paper, and that lab has one set of criteria and another lab has another set of criteria, and so forth. I mean, my suggestion is that it's sort of discussed at the very beginning of the project. Who's going to be an author? What's the order of the authors? What's the journal that you're aiming to submit to? Now, all of this might change during the course of the project, of course, but I think the expectations might be addressed by starting in the beginning of the process. And, some labs might want to have many, let's say, smaller papers of high quality, but maybe many smaller papers. while some labs with a different mentor might want to have one very large paper that tells a larger story. So one lab, they might produce many journal articles a year, where another lab, it'll take 3 or 4 years. There's very different sort of personalities with regard to publication, as you know. And so I think the student should, or the postdoc should, understand what the expectations is, the culture, before they join that research group, and so forth. A postdoc might expect to be there for 3 years, but that lab has a culture of 5 years. Well, that's not a good fit. So these are questions to ask and to sort of look into before deciding which research group to join.
So important.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is so relevant to me because I definitely have colleagues who co-author with, especially with graduate students. And I think that's a very meaningful experience. I have not done that myself, but it is a completely different situation in the STEM field. So I don't know that I have quite as much to say on this.
No, I get it. I get it. So now, audience, I do want you to start placing your questions for us as well. If you want to ask something individually, just flag yourself, and there's my team is back here somewhere, and they'll get you on screen for the question, or you can just put it in the chat. But you've mentioned, Rachel, about issues around gender and your experiences, and I think that's important. So let's talk about inclusion from a wider perspective, from race and ethnicity. How do we assure inclusion in our environments for our mentees, or how do we help them for our BIPOC faculty or graduate students or postdocs? It's a tough, obviously the institution is making progress. It's slow progress. It's slow progress across the academy. This isn't a Colombia, individual challenge. It's slow almost everywhere. How do we advise them around these areas? Any thoughts at all?
That's a really important question. I think you put your finger on it, that we have to hire people, and we not just token representatives of different fields or identities, because then, I see this over and over again, then that person becomes overwhelmed because you have one faculty who represents a new exciting thing, and then you have 10 graduate students and 100. So so those people also need to be supported and mentored, because otherwise they become very unfairly burdened. And what happens sometimes, each person has their own way of dealing with that, but I have some colleagues who have developed ways of shutting out because they can't take. And then I have others who just spend like a really untenable amount of time advising students. I think from where I sit, so I try to support in whatever way possible, both my colleagues of color and the hiring of colleagues of color who can support those students. But also to recognize that there are many different ways to support a student. And I certainly don't think that each student, everybody's different. We all have differences, some of them, more crystallized into identities. And you do not need a person who is an exact match for every aspect of that. That's to right. Be a mentor. And so if we recognize, as Jaime has been saying, that each person needs and deserves lots of different people supporting them in lots of different ways. I have a lot to offer a student of color, just as I have to offer other students. So I would never think to like send that person to another colleague who looks more like them, for example. So I think we also have to recognize like that too is something that should be distributed, not localized in particular people.
Critical, absolutely critical, Rachel. Thank you for saying it, because it matters.
And let me say that there are some real, on top of it, all the important things that Rachel said, there are some real efforts, defined efforts that we can make that can make a difference. And I'll give an example. We have a number of research training programs that are funded by NIH. As part of, it's been a requirement for a long time that there be what they term minority recruitment and retention. But this should not just be words. So I'll give you an example. As part of our organizational structure, we have a defined diversity enhancement committee that's part of recruitment, that's part of career development. So helping folks get into being identified and getting settled and making a success into the research training program, and then helping them transition to the next career stage. We've also started having formal, what I would call pipeline programs, where, we're in New York, really. We should be making an effort with all of our surrounding schools. So if we have an NIH program to support postdocs, we're going to have formal relationships with the graduate programs at CUNY, so that those students can see what it's like to continue their research careers at an institution like Columbia. So not only do they come to us, we will go to them and give presentations. I'll give a career development presentation. So there's real action that can be taken that can make a difference.
Another critically important statement made there, Jaime, this idea that we can recruit and should be looking in other places than just our peer Ivy League institutions.
Absolutely.
Which is a tough one when you get to the department level, because we have this history of wanting to replicate ourselves, meaning people who go to places, the same places we went to. And we see this over and over and over again. So important points. Thank you.
And I think this is also another way that near peers can play a role, because they can see that somebody that's just one career stage ahead of them is succeeding there. And they also didn't come from a big name school or whatever. I remember reading the resume of somebody who came here from another part of the country, and under her hobbies, she wrote goat herding. I don't think I've ever heard of goat herding on a resume before, but clearly she had different life experiences than the vast majority of our other students. And I just thought that was great.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let's think about, are there strategies, are there tips, anything for communicating more transparently with our mentees? Are there things that we could share? Are there shareable things that could be helpful to the audience, especially if you're not in the same field? I think, Rachel, you talked a little bit about that, but most especially if you're not in the same field, are there helpful tips that might allow us to do that a little better? I'm not meaning to stump anyone.
I guess I'll just say the thing I say always about access. Mm-hmm. So we, part of, universal design for learning, like making an accessible curriculum, is that you present things in multiple ways. And so I think, a lot of what Jaime and I have been talking about is that you communicate in multiple ways. And that's very important to transparency, because, sometimes like I remember in the less transparent days when I was untenured, and you would like one result of one quite significant promotion review was delivered to me in a phone call. Like I was at a conference and the chair called me, and there's no record of that. And I didn't have it written down anywhere. So I didn't really remember what he said to me. And people later told me that. So sometimes it's best to communicate orally, and sometimes it's best to communicate in writing. Often it's best to have guidelines. You know, I'm really big on policies and procedures for how you do things, but not everything can be codified in a policy. So, you know, I think the more ways you can present someone with the information they need, and perhaps having more people, again, the distributed model where there are more people supporting each individual, the better for transparency. Actually, that one I want to emphasize.
Yeah.
I do think having ever one person communicating all the instructions and all the feedback is a very bad idea. So having distributed communication.
That's really helpful, Rachel. I'm guilty of that. I've been the guy who gave the information over the phone or on the Zoom meeting or whatever it is, and not in writing. So great point. I stand corrected. Great point. So let's talk a little bit about. So I have a question that came over to me from my team about how to evaluate the efficacy of either training or mentorship. Can we do that? Are there ways to sort of evaluate the efficacy of it? Is that possible?
I mean, I would think that getting feedback from the mentees of the mentor is very important. The success of the mentees during their training period, as well as their transition to the next career stage. I think the students know who are good mentors, or the postdocs know who are good mentors. But I think making the expectation that if one is going to serve as a mentor, they need to do it with the same care and level of excellence that they teach or they do research. That it is, you know, sort of part of how they're going to be judged for promotions and so forth. It's not sort of, oh yeah, I have a student.
That's right.
I think this is such an important question, and I don't really know the answer to it. I mean, from the wrong direction, like the opposite direction of what you're talking about. One reason I was so delighted to get that mentoring award is that I just think that this is something Colombia has not historically recognized. And so I think, you know, Jaime said she's absolutely right. Some people have reputations for being good mentors, other people don't. Because it's not rewarded, there is a disincentive for certain kinds of people to do it. So I think giving people the carrots at the back end, like that's a good idea. I just want to throw a wrench in. Here's why I think this is such a complicated question. I'll just talk about my own situation for a minute, is that because of the work that I do often attract, so there's two things that mean I attract people who are having a lot of trouble. And one is that, you know, often people who are dealing with difficulties because of illness or disability want to work with me because I'm very aware of the nature of those, and I'm very committed to making accommodations. But I also am very committed to the principle that if we hire someone or if we admit someone to our graduate program, part of that is a commitment to supporting them. And so I often get the graduate student who someone else met and they were like, oh, this is not what I had hoped for. So I would say if you looked on paper, I probably have a higher record of failure than some other mentor because I take on those people who are struggling. So I'm just not sure how you measure that, because the person, I have other colleagues who really scrutinize each student once they're in the program, like they've already been admitted, and they pick the ones that impress them. And so those, I don't think you can measure that exclusively on like who has the best placement record or whose students are getting the best jobs. So it's kind of like, to me, a philosophical question about, what it means to support a trainee or a student or an untenured faculty, and what we think is success when they come through such a program. And I don't really have the answers to that.
But let me just clarify that then to say that they are successful in their career stage with that mentor and have successfully transitioned to the next stage and position for whatever is appropriate for them. So clearly not everybody continues in academic research, but they have successfully figured out through different ways of what's the right next position for them. And the mentor has helped them find the right position. So not everybody's going to end up at another Columbia. Maybe they're going to be outside of academia, determine what their next career stage should be.
Yeah, you're both. So you were wonderful with this question. So important. I will say, Rachel, you read my mind. That's exactly why we created this. We had spent, for quite some time, our only major award for faculty that we recognized at commencement was the teaching award, right? Which was critically important. But if we are to encourage things like mentoring, which are critical to the academy, have always been, or service, we felt that the university needed to represent that at its highest level. And that was an end of year commencement award that was the equivalent to the teaching award for both faculty mentoring and faculty service. And that's what we've done over the last couple of years. So your understanding of it as a recipient is exactly why we did it. We have to model it as vital to the institution if we want to continue to encourage our faculty to move forward in this area. We can't just talk about it. We have to walk the walk as well. So that's what we're trying to do.
That is lovely. Can I just interject one more little kudos for my own division for arts and sciences, that we historically every year you fill out a form where you kind of just discuss, what you've been doing with yourself all year. And in the past few years, for the first time, those forms are acknowledging all kinds of invisible labor and making space for people to write down, how many hours you put into mentoring and writing letters for people and reading people's files. And, that has always been key to the profession functioning, but is only recently starting to be seen. And I think that is tremendously important. And it's going to make a lot of people who might have seemed, unproductive based on certain standards, seem suddenly the hardworking colleagues that they are.
That's exactly right. And we all know it's unwritten, but that this is disproportionately carried by women faculty and faculty of color, right? They disproportionate. And so the ability to make it less invisible matters. It matters a lot. So I'm glad to hear that about ANS. Good for them. Hopefully we'll see more and more and more of this, because we're making it visible. It's critical. Thank you both. I want to say one more thing about Jaime. this idea, about how you actually measure this, the academy is horrible at it. We just don't do this well. But if we look at our corporate or industry, colleagues, they use 360-degree assessment for almost everything. And I'm not saying that that's perfect at all, or even how it would be implemented in the academy, but it's something we could always think about. I don't know that it could hurt us to have 360-degree review. So just throwing that out there, being controversial as we end this wonderful conversation. I am so grateful to the two of you. Thank you for your time for this conversation. I'm going to throw it over to Adina to close for us, but I'm very grateful and appreciative.
I want to join Dennis in thanking you both so much for such a really great conversation. And I particularly want to thank Rachel, the fact that you do take on the hard cases, both because that's where our humanity is. And I think as an institution, it's faculty like you who do that work that remind us that we're not just robots, we're not just automatons. And I think that's just so crucial. And so many of those people, even when you hit those, a student in that group who is then traditionally successful, the ripple effects of their success on other people's success is so dramatic. And that's, I think, a big reason why, we've committed to really furthering this work in our inclusive faculty pathways work. And I think it's that kind of mentoring and those kinds of things. You don't have any idea how it's going to impact people way beyond you. And so I just wanted to personally thank you for that, because I think our institution needs more of that.
Yeah, I just want to say that's the importance of role models. Right. So she, Dr. Adams does it. So I'm going to do it too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So for those of you who are here with us, if you have other questions, please contact us. And I think that there's some activity in the chat and our email, which is facultyadvancement@columbia.edu, or in our faculty Slack workspace. If you're using Slack, there's ways for you to be in touch with each other there. Also on April 27th, we're going to have a session on understanding and doing anti-racist classroom assessment with Dr. Asao Inoue, which we're really excited about. And my screen just went away, and I know that it's in the registration is in the chat. And we're also going to be sending a follow-up survey for today's session, which was recorded. So if you are here and you want to share this with other folks, stay tuned for that survey, and there will be a link to this recording as well. With that, send around the Slack info. Yes, we absolutely will. We'll include that in the follow-up email so that people can find us on Slack. And with that, I wish everyone a great afternoon. You can see us at Columbia Faculty on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all the fun stuff. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.